Good morning, and many thanks to the organizers of Care and Conservation for enabling us to finally have this conference. My name is Cullhed, and I work as a Strategic Development Manager at Uppsala University Library. I have a background in heritage management and in conservation. The topic of my presentation is the analysis and some conclusions from a Swedish 15th century manuscript kept at my library. It's a parchment manuscript and a version of the 14th century King Magnus Eriksson's law corpus. It's dated to the 1430s on the basis of the scribal hand, and it's commonly referred to as B68, which is the shelf mark of the book. The first and most obvious feature when you see the binding is that it must have been rebound at some time in its history. It was then fitted with a full parchment binding with cardboard boards. It was trimmed at all edges, and the edges were colored in red. It's still possible to see the traces of the original binding on the parchment paste down. There are traces of a reddish leather still clinging to the paste down, and also fibers from what may be presumed to be an original wooden board. The manuscript is fully digitized, and it can be accessed in Alvin, the Swedish digital repository for cultural heritage material. All pages are rendered in 400 dpi downloadable TIFFs and are free to use for whatever purpose. The digitization has been very practical when examining the binding, as the miniatures could be used to plan the analysis of taking samples. More on that later on. The manuscript is illustrated with 16 images, each one of them corresponding to the different law codes written under the illustrations. In the analysis of the quire structure, it could be seen that the illustrations were singleton leaves added to the text quires. Thanks to BioArch at the University of York and the generosity and interest of Sarah Fidiment, we were supplied with a set of test tubes for each of the leaves in the manuscript for the purpose of analyzing the types of animals in the parchment, based on the DNA profiles typical for specific animal skins. The testing could be done in the reading room of Uppsala University Library. A brush with the synthetic bristles was used, and gloves were worn throughout the testing procedure, so as not to smudge the samples with modern DNA. The supplied test tubes came with a piece of rubber, one for each tube. Before the actual testing, an analysis of the quire structure was essential to be able to place each test correctly, one for each bifolium. An Excel spreadsheet supplied the necessary functions to be able to register the different elements of the structure, as can be seen here and here. In this example, we see quire number 5 with a sewing in the middle. It's the rust-colored line, yellow being an illustration, and green is the folded end of a singleton leaf. Numbering is quite easy in the spreadsheet structure. This was done beforehand, before the analysis, to be able to know the required amount of test tubes. The thumbnail images in Alvin were downloaded by screenshots, turned into PDFs, and then marked with the places where the sampling took place. Here you see the bifolia marked with red borders that were numbered, and the area where the sampling took place is marked with blue rectangles. They're quite small on this picture, but you might see them here and here. Here you can see the sampling procedure, where the crumbs from the rubber were collected on a folded sheet of paper. These crumbs gently remove collagen fibers from the parchment. The same paper was used to fill the test tubes with enough crumbs. It was a challenge to be able to fill the test tubes with enough material, and in some cases there may have been too little. Here you can see the cone part of the tube being filled almost filled. Ideally, at least half of the tube seems to have been a desired amount. The results from the analysis came in a spreadsheet form from BioArch, and it could be noted that in all cases where a result could be reached, the skin was calf, of relatively good quality. No other types of skins could be noted, and this seems very typical for a Swedish manuscript, as cattle was the basis for medieval farming. All the results were noted in the spreadsheet for each bifolium and singleton leaf. All pages with illustrations could be analyzed, and as already said, they were calf. The fact that they were all singletons added to the binding later suggests that they were produced separately and added to the written page before binding the volume. Separate scriptoria and artist studios may have been a fact in this production, as I suppose in many others. Here you can see the 8 last illustrations from the book. And now to the binding. We already have seen something of the first binding, but how should we date the rebinding? At a first glance, we may see a 17th or 18th century binding. The headband is, for example, very common in 17th century bindings. The end papers were examined more closely at this point, and indeed yielded some results. Firstly, it was obvious that they were produced before approximately 1750, as by this time development of the paper mold made the sheet smoother and typically avoided the shading around the chain lines, so typical of pre-1750 papers. This gave at least one clue. And the rest of the watermarks first gave only vague information. We had a crown, we had some initials, text, and I used a light sheet to backlight the watermark. But as you can see from these images, it was quite hard to see the watermarks, so they needed to be traced in some way. And the best method turned out to be an iPad app called Procreate. I uploaded the watermarks there, added a new layer, and then I could trace the outlines on that layer and export the traced layer only, then in black and white. The most interesting watermark seemed to be the one with the name on it. At first it read out SEFSIO, SEFSIO. You can see that more clear here. It was traced by the method I already described, and here you can see the result. At first I thought about an Italian paper mill, but I soon realized that the last letter, an O, in fact should be an Ö, the typical Swedish letter with 2 dots over the O. But the 2 dots must have been difficult to handle on the mold, so they were practically invisible. And the SEFSIO is an old spelling for Säfsjö, today a town in southern Sweden. And it's known that a paper mill was active in a nearby village called Säfsjöströms in the later 17th century. It burned in 1739, and these facts suggested a time span for the binding from the late 17th to the early 18th century. This is the place of the former paper mill. You can see it on the red dot down below here. The green dot up here is Uppsala, where I sit at the moment. Here you see some spellings of the place name. 2 modern at top, Säfsjö and Säfsjöströms, and 3 historical names below. Historical spelling, that is. The image shows the place where the paper mill used to be. Only the foundation stones remind us of the paper-making activities that used to be there. And here is another of the watermarks. It consists of a crown and the letters CR, which could correspond to Carolus Rex, and the two kings, Charles XI and Charles XII, who died in 1697 and 1718, sorry. Later, it was found that the tracing technique could be effectively used to merge watermarks in bound volumes by tracing the upper and lower parts separately, and then joining the separate images into one image. To render the paper marks, the watermarks in their proper size, a PowerPoint template was made in A4 size. Two rulers were added. The larger one, down below, was aligned to the short side of the A4 210mm size, and the smaller one was aligned to the large ruler and thus calibrated. After adding the watermark, this was aligned to the small ruler and the known width between the chain lines. This can then be exported as an image and printed out in A4 in a 1:1 size. My last slide here shows a newly published book written in Swedish with all the information I have supplied here in this presentation, and also many other chapters covering different aspects of the book. It can be downloaded for free or purchased at a moderate cost. This is my final slide, and I wish to thank you for your attention, and really hope that the next conference can take place in lovely Copenhagen. Thank you.